Folks, welcome back to So Bad It's Good, presented by Betches Media. Today, I am so excited to talk to our guest. You guys know me in my relationship with sports. Now, listen, sometimes sports itself, it's hard for me to watch, but you know what I love to watch? I love to watch sports documentaries and docuseries. It provides context to a place, and in this case, New York. It provides this kind of history to a potential dynasty that we eventually receive with the most amazing team, the New York Yankees. But to get to a dynasty, you have to go through a lot of stuff to get to that place. And this story that we're going to talk about today, and this docuseries, which you need to watch on Peacock this weekend or this week, it is fantastic. It's called Bronx Zoo 90, Crime, Chaos, Baseball. And it's a 3-part docuseries that takes you in the 1990s New York Yankees, George Steinbrenner, Deion Sanders. I mean, it sets up what you see will eventually become this dynasty, but it took so much pain and crime and just bad vibes all around to get there. We have this series director with us today. Now, I got to tell this man, he just gave me his email address, and it reminded me he directed one of my favorite films from 2002, The Salton Sea. He's an amazing film director in his own right, and I can't wait to see what inspired him to start telling stories in documentary form. The filmmaker, DJ Caruso, joins us. DJ, thank you so much for being here, man.
Oh man, thank you for having me. It's great to hear your enthusiasm for the project and the time. It's getting me pumped up again. So thank you.
Well, I mean, truly, how long have you been working on this?
About 2.5 years. It took about 2.5 years from the moment we said, let's do this and go ahead, to the time we got it back on air on the Peacock network. It took 2.5 years. Documentary, it was my first documentary, my first foray into documentary filmmaking. And it was really educational for me because it's like a college thesis paper. You start with a thesis, You have some ideas, and then you end up doing research and going in this direction, that direction. And so it was really, really, really interesting, but it was a lot of research. And because we're set in the 90s, just finding footage and getting interviews and finding the right things. It wasn't like, The Last Dance had the blessing of someone was documenting that last season, right? So they had all this amazing stuff. We had to mine the gold and try to find these pieces and these clips and these interviews and see who's still around from 1990. So,
it's funny because there is even one moment, I think it's like the second or the third part, you're trying to find this interview that they're talking about, or this, they're like, it was just 8 of us in the room. We wouldn't have filmed that thing. And I thought, what a great moment. But just to share with the audience, first off, to use a baseball term, you hit this out of the park. I watch a lot of sports documentaries like The Last Dance, and this kept me in it. Like I was kind of bummed after the third part ended. And I guess to sum up to the people out there, why did you want to tell this story about the New York Yankees?
Well, it's interesting. It's twofold in a way, because one is it's so hard to believe how awful they were on and off the field in 1990. It's if you start telling the stories, someone brought cougars in the locker room, there's a pedophile, there's an owner who's fighting with this and he's dealing with a gambler. It's unbelievable how bad they were on and off the field in 1990. But what's most intriguing to me was, 4 years later, the Yankees are the best team in baseball. There's a strike. They don't get to go to the World Series. They win these World Series in this dynasty build. So for me, it was, and again, we began this project. I read these articles during the COVID period. So we're all thinking like, here we are down, and the Yankees were down. So for me, there was this sort of phoenix rising from the ashes story of like, no matter how bad it gets, if you persevere and you make the right decisions, you can get out of it and see some light. So from a narrative drive as a filmmaker, I was intrigued by that. And then also just the cast of characters, from Mel Hall to Deion Sanders to George Steinbrenner to what happened with Winfield to Donnie Mattingly, Pascual Perez to Don Mattingly, who got dragged into this, to Howie Spiro, who's this little gangster, to Chaz Easterly, who's this young 15-year-old girl in a relationship with a Yankee who's come out to be somewhat stronger and a survivor. So there were so many great characters in there. Like if it was just a narrative film alone, you would have to pick and choose which ones you can tell the story from.
And you really do it. You set up this cast of characters like we're out there going to work ourselves, and we have these people that we go to work with at a 9 to 5. The Yankees had that same vibe. They were going into locker rooms, and I guess we can drill down on Mel Hall to begin with, because to me that's a fascinating and tragic story, is that you set up this Mel Hall, played for the New York Yankees, and he wasn't really well liked by his teammates. He was kind of an ass in a lot of ways. And there is one story that is highlighted and you have a lot of people talking about, which is funny, where he brings in like two cougars into the, like not two cougars like older ladies, guys, like two actual animal cougars into the locker room, and they just piss everywhere. And then a poor bat boy has to clean up the piss. That's an insane story. And it's almost kind of endearing because you're like, oh, this guy's like a really quirky guy.
Yeah, Mel Hall was a very interesting guy. I mean, obviously he has a lot of issues, and he's in jail because of some of these issues, which are serious. But he was just feeding off the idea of being in New York. It's 1990. The Mets in the 80s were sort of this party team, and the Mets sort of owned New York from 86 to 80 to 90. So I think Mel kind of fell into like just being this guy who's in New York. Mattingly gets hurt. Winfield gets traded. So Mel feels like he's the guy, like he's the man, right? He is the man in New York. And he might have led the team in home runs and RBIs that year. So he was just feeling it, but he was just, I don't know where you get live cougars in New York. He kind of got them in Florida and but he literally was bringing cougars in the locker room. He had exotic sports cars. He was just one of those guys that was just lived in the Trump Tower, even though he couldn't really afford it. It's just one of those guys who just like lived paycheck by paycheck and lived above his means. And he was just not a great teammate.
Well, and you get an actual jailhouse interview with Mel Hall, and I want to tell the audience why that jailhouse interview is in a jailhouse, is that it also tells the story, and it's a very brave story because you actually, I think, have one of the first sit-downs with this amazing woman. I believe her name is Chaz Easterly. Right. She was 15 years old when her dad brought her to the Yankees. He was like a Yankees fan, and they would go to the games, and in one of those games, Mel Hall comes up and talks to the family. And then literally, I think they write in to get autographs from him, like, we met you at the game. He proceeds then to call this 15-year-old girl the next day, and they don't believe that it's Mel Hall, you guys. And he's like, listen, I'm designated hitter. I'm going to hit my bat 3 times on the home plate. I'm going to point at the camera. It's me, Mel Hall. And he did that. And then that preceded this kind of dance with the family of almost grooming this family to make it acceptable for Mel Hall to date or be with Chaz Easterly as a 15-year-old girl. I did not know this story at the time. I was a kid, but this shocks me because it was out in the open in front of everyone.
Yeah, it's incredible. And one of our producers, Brian Hunt, who actually went to high school with Chaz, remembers this happening and like thinking, this is crazy. Mel Hall was at our senior prom and Mel Hall was here. It was just, it's everyone asks me to explain, like, how could this happen or how could this be allowed to happen? And
yeah, you asked that question in the documentary. How did everybody knew it? There was a news report about it and people were like, oh, they're just in love. It's fine.
Yeah, I know. And I don't know. I guess 1990 or the times, it's just so bizarre. And like the fact that her family was complicit and like sort of like accepting, and Mel Hall, a week after they met, Mel Hall moved into their house in Connecticut, 1 week after they met. So it was just sort of this starstruck thing, and he
shows up in a limo. Like,
he shows up in a limo. He takes her to Arnie's arcade. I'm from Connecticut. I'm in Norwalk. I know where Arnie's is, and he took her to Arnie's arcade. They went to the arcade and literally told her he loves her and wanted to marry her, and that began the manipulation and sort of his way that he got into the family. And then obviously Mel's in jail now in Texas because what happened was this was a pattern that he never broke. He was, 5, 6 other girls he was convicted of doing
as young as 13 years old, I believe, in one of them. Yeah,
horrible things. But this was who Mel was, and this was a pattern that his career as a pedophile is like it's every single incident is almost the same exact story when you talk to him.
Yeah, it turns out it wasn't just love with Chaz Easterly. This was a pattern of behavior that he went on to commit. Yeah. But the other shocking thing, like, you have so many amazing details in this, that he does move into that parent's house. The parents switch bedrooms so they can have the parents' bedroom, and the parents go into Chaz's bedroom and live. And I was like, and then he moves her into Trump Tower, which by the way, Mr. Donald Trump appears a couple of times in this docuseries. One, because he used to hang out with Mel Hall and they used to be buddy, but Mel Hall wasn't paying his rent. And then Donald Trump actually bumps into Chaz on the street away from Mel Hall and says, hey, are you okay in that relationship? Do you need help getting out of the relationship? And that was the day she was like, yeah, let me get out of here and have my dad pick me up.
Yeah. It's kind of, there's a lot of irony in this story that Donald Trump was the one who kind of woke her up and said, hey, you got to get out of this. And Donald Trump is in the documentary mainly too, because Donald Trump patterned himself after George Steinbrenner. George Steinbrenner was Donald Trump before there was Donald Trump, a guy who controlled the media, who used the newspapers against each other, and literally was so he Trump admired Steinbrenner and sort of wanted to emulate him, and then at the same time, Mel Hall Yankee is living in Trump Tower and not paying his rent, and Trump sees this relationship and basically tells Chaz, like, you need help getting out of this. This thing ain't right. Something's wrong about this. And so that was sort of her eye opener, which was again, I think that's slightly ironic, but interesting.
I mean, I think you're on like to the right story to tell when it kind of hits all of these other like focal points.
Yeah,
like you're like, oh wow, you can draw these lines in every which direction.
Yeah, and that's why I was telling you, the more you dig into the research and talk to people, then you start to see and you can make all these connections. That's something we didn't know when we started the documentary. And actually finding Chaz, who hadn't spoken about this, but now is out there speaking about it and an advocate, and then getting in to talk to Mel Hall. No one had ever done that over all these years. Joel Sherman, who wrote the articles that the series was inspired and based on.
What outlet was this? Is it New York Post?
New York Post. It was New York Post. Yeah. What happened was during COVID, when there was no sporting events to cover, Joel decided to sort of go back and talk about his first year as a beat reporter in New York. And he was assigned the New York Yankees, and this is the Yankees he was assigned to. And he just thought, well, this has got to be like every team, right? Then he realized, no. So it was inspired by that. So getting to talk to them, and Joel had tried to reach out to find Chaz or to find Mel Hall, and nobody spoke to him. So it took us about 5 or 6 months to get to them and talk to them. And as you said, in the Mel, as for me as a filmmaker or as a fan, you kind of go in and thinking, okay, I'm going to talk to Mel. He's been in there for now, I don't know, 10 years or something. He's still got 40 years left. Remorse, please forgive me. He was just, you saw it. I mean, it was so bizarre having that interview and speaking with him. I just let him talk because I was like actually like speechless in a way.
That's what I was going to ask, what the experience was, because he seems, I wouldn't say jovial, but he seems kind of like, like this, it was very interesting. It was almost like a housewives talking head, as opposed to, I've done this horrible thing and I'm looking for penance. So I found that very interesting. And it's really great to hear your perspective, because I was going to ask, what's that like to go into these situations of not knowing how this person potentially is going to be and kind of feel that out and write it out. And at the same time, you're thinking about a director and trying to piece these things in the story that you're telling.
Yeah, and I think, for me, again, having not a lot of experience in this, in preparing my questions, I didn't want to be like a got you guy, a reporter who goes, a guy who goes in there and says, you did this and you did this and you did this. And so to get Mel contentious. So, we started to talk about the Yankees and the situation and baseball and this, and then Chaz. And obviously he didn't want to talk about the cases in Texas. That's just something he's got appeals on all those cases. But it was just, it was interesting. You go in there and you write a letter like to the prison, and they say, yes, Melvin Hall Jr., prisoner number 10655. So, and you just realize him. And I got there and finally got in through all the high security, and nobody there knows he's Mel Hall, who played baseball, the Yankee.
Wow.
He's just a guy who's in there, and he's a pedophile, and he's in jail. And they're all, well, and then one of the wardens said, hey, I found a baseball card. I didn't know that he was a baseball player. And you kind of go through that. The doors open and he comes out and you start speaking, and then you just I just sort of let it go. But it did not go the way I expected it, and there didn't seem to be much for us. Yeah.
No, it was very interesting. And by the way, guys, this is just a fraction of the story that he's telling. What he just mentioned, though, before was George Steinbrenner, and you cannot mention the New York Yankees without this man. It really is this fascinating story of what he bought he purchased the Yankees was 1979. Is that, or when?
I think it was 70. I think it was 73. He purchased 73? The Yankees. Yeah, with a group for $8 million.
$8 million. Times were good back then. Wow.
I think he bought it, believe it or not, CBS owned the Yankees, because back then there was like not conflict of interest, so CBS owned the Yankees, and basically he bought them with a group for $8 million. They're now worth arguably $10 billion right now, the New York Yankees. So crazy.
George Steinbrenner would be he's probably so upset he's not alive just to be in control still, because what you actually make the point is that this man loved control. This man had a vice grip, and he went through so many baseball managers, so many coaches, so many players, and you set up, what a character. He had a player, Dave Winfield, that seemed very loved, a good man, and he fought to get him out of there tooth and nail, like every season. And it's this fascinating story of like, how can you be on a team when you know the person that owns this does not want you there?
Yeah. Well, George, when he bought the team in 73, I think by 77, 79 in the Reggie Jackson World Series, they're winning the World Series, and Reggie Jackson puts the Yankees on top of the world. So George is deciding, hey, this is good. Things are working out really well. How do I keep this going, right? So Reggie's about 35 years old in 1979. So 1980, George decides, I'm going to sign Dave Winfield. He's the next guy. He's down there in San Diego in this small market. His numbers are incredible. He's the greatest baseball player in the world. I'm going to bring him to New York. I got Reggie 2.0. We're going to ride this thing out for all through the 80s. Well, cut to a long story. The 80s, the Yankees didn't win any championships. It's the one decade that they didn't win any World Series, right? And George signs this great contract with Dave Winfield at the time, which was really high paid. I think it was like $19 million or something silly. We laugh at that today.
I know. I love that Don Mattingly gets this contract and it's like $9 million. I'm like, what? He's like, it's the biggest contract ever. Yeah.
I know. That's like a bench player now, right? The bench player won't sign for $9 million. So anyway, George didn't realize at the time, there's a little agent that Winfield had who was a really clever guy, kind of a little bit scummy. He put a cost of living expense in there that George and his lawyers were unaware of, and it ended up making over the life of the contract, he was going to owe Winfield another $12 million. And so from the day he signed and realized that contract was signed, George hated Dave Winfield. Like, he felt betrayed already. So like Joel Sherman says in our documentary, the day that he married Dave Winfield, he wanted to divorce Dave Winfield, and the divorce took 10 years, right? It took 10 years to get rid of him.
Well, it's interesting. These relationships, as you point out, I mean, they're kind of like marriages. They're very personal. This sport is personal to the fans. It's personal to the players. It's personal to the owners. And I think that's why there is such passion involved, because it does become this very personal story. Steinbrenner, like you mentioned, you have that little section with Donald Trump, like just hanging out with him all the time and studying him. And kind of, you make this point that this is before Twitter, you guys. So Steinbrenner had this, I don't know if it's brilliant, but it's a very effective way of using things like the New York Post to put out messages, to put out things like, I ain't happy with Winfield, to like everybody knew like Steinbrenner would speak through these outlets, or it would be kind of rumor mill or whatever. And this is before Twitter. And it is interesting to kind of make that connection with Trump of like, oh, wow, this person puts out the message this way. And it was effective. But at the same time, it is interesting because I did not know as a kid the story of, I didn't realize that Steinbrenner eventually threw, and you have an interview with this gentleman as well, Howard Spira, who is a real character. And it turns out that Howard Spira offered Steinbrenner, you guys, information on Dave Winfield to potentially use against his own player to get him out. And Spira says, oh yeah, his foundation was like siphoning money off the top for his personal stuff. And Steinbrenner goes into bed with this guy kind of lightly and says, give me all you got, give me all you got. But then this Howard Spira becomes a barnacle on Steinbrenner's back. He will not let him go. He wants more money and more money. And eventually this leads to Steinbrenner being ejected as the team owner, right?
Yeah. George Steinbrenner was kicked out of baseball in 1990 because of his dealings with Howie Spira. And, you think it's like this really powerful, incredible man who somehow, some way trusts this little two-bit gangster to give him information. When, at the time, when you look at it back now and you deconstruct it, you realize first Spira went to Winfield to extort Winfield, then he went to Steinbrenner to export Steinbrenner because he had all these gambling debts. So how George fell or got in bed with him was just because the thing about George was he really reacted emotionally to everything. Like if a cab driver in New York City told him when he got in the cab that your second baseman was no good, George would think about, maybe I should trade my second baseman. Like he was just an emotional person. Like, so I think when he got to Spira, he was so desperate to find stuff on Winfield that he got in bed with this guy, and it literally took him down. And George Steinbrenner in 1990, all these things happened in the 80s. And by 1990, when baseball was investigating it, George Steinbrenner was banned for baseball for life. I mean, it only lasted 2 years, but he was banned for baseball for life. And one of the most shocking and beautiful quotes of the documentary is, as we know in the documentary, once Steinbrenner gets banned from baseball, he hands over the reins to Gene Michael. Gene Michael makes all these great decisions, nurtures the farm system. So, and the dynasty, prevails here and wins the World Series in 1996. So Howie Spira says in the documentary, which I thought was just so beautiful, I've done more for the New York Yankees than anyone who's ever picked up a baseball bat.
Yes, That was such a, oh man, I wrote that quote down because I was like, that is a, how did you actually, and it seems like maybe potentially Mr. Spira is somebody that likes to talk. So was it easy or hard to get that interview with him?
It actually was difficult to get the interview with him just to set it up because there's always, how he wants some money. Is he going to get paid? Is he going to do
That's
this?
what I was wondering is like, what are you going to do for me, Mr. Caruso?
Yeah,
what are you going to do for me?
And, I think Howie really wants a movie and a book. So I think he realized that maybe this exposure can do something for him. But it was interesting. It was hard to get the interview. But once Howie starts talking, you can't stop him. And what from reporters who've covered him and someone who's done some exposés on him, the thing about Howie Spira is you have to listen carefully and decipher what is the truth and what is Howie's reality or non-reality. Because a lot of what Howie says is it's BS, really. It's really BS. But there are nuggets of truth in a lot of what he says. I mean, he did have a check from Dave Winfield for $15,000 that he said Winfield paid him for gambling debts. Did he pay him for who knows what it's really for, but he does have a check from Dave Winfield.
But then he's livid because Dave Winfield charged him so much in interest. It's like, how dare this guy charge me $18,500 for interest?
Yeah, exactly. And is that true? I don't know, right? But who knows, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And then Steinbrenner, he Howie was a guy who didn't trust anybody. The mob was all after him. He owed money to all the five crime families, and he recorded.
Yeah, that's the other point. This involves the mob. He's like, he proudly boasts, I'm one of the only guys that have owed money to all 5 crime families. And they actually have a recording. Well, where did you find, you actually have a recording of a conversation. Does he give you that? Like, how do you uncover?
Yeah, Howie recorded a lot of his stuff, and then he didn't have some of it because now some of the FBI, because what happened was Howie was eventually convicted of extorting Steinbrenner at the end of it, because he was once he didn't get more money, he kept coming and he was extorting him. So Howie went away for 2.5 years because of extortion. So the FBI also had some of these recordings and things that Howie had, and so we got access through them through like public access, and Howie had a few of these recordings as well. But yeah, it was pretty crazy to hear. There's a mob guy that basically tells him, we're gonna kill you.
And then Howie, in that phone call with George Steinbrenner that's recorded it, and he's like, I gave you money. And he's like, I don't care. I want more money. I don't care what you did. And I'm like, I can't. Well, and hats off to your team of people that got all of this wealth of information. And that's why this story, guys, is so amazing to watch, because it's not just interviews. You have like the pictures, you have the video, you have the audio, and it really takes you inside. This isn't some like kind of hacky documentary or something. It takes you fully in there where you get so invested. And that's why I went up, like afterwards, I started looking up Steinbrenner, because I remember as a kid, I didn't remember that piece where I remember him as like, Larry David did his voice on Seinfeld and he was working for the Yankees then. So it was like, I didn't know there was a period of time he wasn't with the Yankees. And I thought it was interesting in that 2.5 or 2 year period that he did get ejected from baseball, that he went on a image rehab campaign. He did SNL. He was all of a sudden loving to kids and families, and he rehabbed his image. And it shows you, and that you can make actual probably connections with the political system, is that it turns out the commissioner of baseball doesn't have the power. It's the owners of the team. And they were the ones that said there was a lane open for Steinbrenner to come back. What was the vibe in New York, do you feel, because it seems like he was such a hated and loved man when he actually got to come back to baseball? What was the vibe of Yankees fans in that moment in time?
Well, it's so interesting because there is such love for this man and there was such disdain for this man, and I mean, that's just sort of the Yankees fans. So the same people that were cheering him going away also cheered when he came back into baseball, because I think George, at the end of the day, people understood that he wanted to win at all costs. He wanted the Yankees to be the best team in baseball. And there was so many fans that really sort of missed his presence when he wasn't around. And you can argue that when George came back, he did do a little bit of the George stuff and pick up a free agent, whether it's a Paul O'Neill or, and then a Wade Boggs, and those little pieces that George put together with Gene helped the Yankees win the World Series. But he was a man that, like, it's funny, every player that I interviewed, you can tell when you see the documentary, they all referred to him as Mr. Steinbrenner. Mr. Steinbrenner. There was a respect. So the players had a respect for him, even though he might berate them in the media. The players had a respect for him. And when he was kicked out of the game in 1990, and I like to believe that, talking to Susan Waldman and stuff, that when George it was announced that he was kicked out of baseball in 1990, the Yankees were playing the Detroit Tigers at Yankee Stadium. And when the crowd found out that he was kicked out of baseball, they all stood up and started to cheer, like a standing ovation. And I really believe that pierced his heart, because I think he might have realized at the time that the city had turned on him. They had turned on him and they didn't trust him anymore. And then eventually he did that image rehab that you talked about, and he got on Seinfeld, he hosted Saturday Night Live, and he came back a kinder and gentler George, right? And then
and then he got to end his career with like seeing the actual dynasty come to fruition that they had been planting seeds,
He did. And also, when you do talk to the players, and again, if I did I could have done a whole George Steinbrenner documentary, which would have been fascinating. He did have a good heart, like players that like gave players second chances, the Darryl Strawberries, the Doc Goodens, guys who were in trouble. Like George did have a good heart. He just was a guy who, in my opinion, reacted so emotionally to things that he made a lot of mistakes, because when you react emotionally and don't think things out, you're just kind of out there. So, yeah.
But that's sports. And I think the docuseries actually does. I mean, it tells the truth, but it also does. You are sympathetic and empathetic to him. And he's one of those characters that you kind of still root for, you still root for even after all this. As we start winding down, because I know you only have limited time here, I want to say it's also full of kind of stories that will potentially warm your heart. They finally get to, I think the playoffs are close to the playoffs, and Don Mattingly, this long suffering baseball player, and you guys growing up in Kansas, a Don Mattingly rookie card was like all the kids on my street. We would, like, if you got one, you would try to get it from that other kid. And it was just that. And you even showing the Hitman poster, I was like, oh my God, my buddy Danny had that poster in his wall. It took me back to those times when I was like, oh my God, that was like gold if you got to have that poster or the Don Mattingly card. But his story was so fascinating of, Steinbrenner really kind of like not signing his contract until the very last minute. He had a lot of like back problems and things like this. But at the very end, when was it a playoff game, or was it when
Don Mattingly in his illustrious career only got to play in one playoff series against Seattle Mariners in 1995. In all of his career, he missed out. Like Don just missed the dynasty. Like if his back could have stayed healthy for 2 or 3 more years, he'd have 3 World Series championships. He just couldn't play anymore. But in 1995, they reached the playoffs. It's actually the first year of the wild card, and the Yankees are in the wild card game. I think they're playing Seattle, and Don Mattingly gets his first chance to play postseason baseball in New York City. And he told me he went out there and grabbed the dirt and he just held it and thought it was great. And he ends up hitting a home run and has his amazing moment. I think he batted .420 in that series or something crazy. But the Yankees ended up losing that series in 1995. But he had his moment in the postseason. But it's a bittersweet thing, because Don Mattingly isn't in the Hall of Fame, and he's the one Yankee.
That's shocking to me.
Yeah,
you point that out.
Yeah, he's the one Yankee great who never won a World Series, and so deserved to be. Well,
and I just loved when you talk about the sound in the stadium when he hits that homer. I mean, people thought that the stadium was going to collapse. They were in the dugout thinking the dugout was going to collapse. It was this kind of beautiful moment that you're like, God.
Yeah, that's the thing about Yankee fans. There's Yankees in sports. They're so beloved Don Mattingly. They just, and the fact that the Yankee fans are so well schooled in baseball and knowing that just to get Don Mattingly in the playoffs in the World Series, or just to get him in the playoffs or the postseason, that was magic enough. So it's almost like a character they grew up with and appreciated that he finally got to almost get to the top of the mountain.
Yeah.
And they were with him. And so it's such a magical moment. Yeah. Buck Showalter talks about it. Joel Sherman talks about it. Bernie Williams, just that home run that he hit was just. And you have Mattingly
himself in it, and he almost tears up. I mean, you got some great talking heads in this thing, and I know we got to wind down here, but Mr. Caruso, did this sour you on documentaries? Will you keep working in this format? Because I feel like this seemed like a natural fit. I don't know the struggles you went through over 2.5 years, but man, I was invested.
No, I definitely got the bug. And want to do it again. It's like, to find the project and to find the characters and to find something to dive into. What's so beautiful about it is you do give so much time to it that it really becomes your baby, and it starts to breathe and live and finding the rhythm. And I love the way that, I feel proud about the way we put it all together and had to make decisions about leaving stuff out. But yeah, I am so enamored by this process, and I definitely want to dive into it and do it again for sure.
And what do you hope audiences take from this? And
You
if,
know,
I feel like this is one of those things that's going to keep growing. People are going to keep watching this and finding this and discovering this.
yeah, well, I think audiences twofold. One, I hope they realize, like, wow, this is incredible. I cannot believe that this prestigious franchise, like probably the greatest franchise in sports history, had this big pimple on their face. I didn't know about it, and all these struggles and all the things. But at the end of the day, I think the narrative drive of, like, no matter how bad it gets, like, you can start over, or you can have a rebirth, and you can stumble and fall, but you can get back up. And look at that, the Yankees in 1996 and 1999, and they just kept winning, and it's sort of it really is a phoenix rising from the ashes story. So I think I want them to be entertained. I also want them to be inspired by Chaz's story. Here's a woman, 34 years later, who's now strong and a great mother and an advocate, and
was able to testify against Mel Hall.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
actually, they said, the Texas jury said, you are one of the reasons why we actually put this man behind bars, because of the bravery of you coming forward and sharing your story from all those years ago.
Exactly. So there's all that. So there's great characters. If you love baseball, you're gonna dive into it. There's magic moments where Kevin Moss has his 10 minutes of fame.
I know.
Dion and Bill.
Yeah, you guys, I didn't even get to, like, so many characters, but that's why it's like 3 parts. It's so easy to watch. You're gonna want to watch all 3 at once. I started with one, thought I was gonna pace it out, and then I just kept going, and I got so into it. Then afterwards, I started looking up information. I was so excited to talk to you today. Thank you for being so great. You did such amazing work, and I can't wait for you guys to go out and watch this. And let's talk about it after you do, because I was like, should I start watching baseball again? I was like, I went and like uncovered my Yankees hat just to wear for the interview. But DJ Caruso, also a fantastic filmmaker. I also the Salton Sea. I got to tell you, there was a period of time when that went on like HBO or something. I watched that like every week. So truly amazing.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you for the enthusiasm for the project too. I really appreciate it.
Well, you guys go check this out on Peacock. I'll put all the information, and we will talk to you again hopefully someday.
Great. Thank you. Take care.
Okay.